Make up mind. Fight.
Critical hits are definitely a mechanic in TF2, and that's all I can say because I really don't want to be killed in the street today. Not for real though, critical hits are contentious in TF2 for a reason. Randomly dealing 3 times extra damage in an otherwise very skill and execution based game is definitely a bit funny sometimes, but also borderline frustrating when you're on the receiving end of it. That said, you really only hear people complaining about random critical hits in TF2, and the game has plenty of other ways to deal them. A lot of these are perfectly liked and respected, like you don't often hear people complaining about things like the Kritzkrieg or even Pyro's Puff and Sting combos. That said, what about weapons that store guaranteed crits? Weapons that, with optimal play, can theoretically grant the player a near infinite supply of 3 times damage attacks so long as they can stay alive to use whenever they want. There are exactly 3 of these weapons in the game, and they range in reception from being perfectly well liked to somewhere in the middle to downright hated. In this video, I want to talk about TF2's crit storing weapons. Weapons that allow the player to store guaranteed critical hits that they can use whenever they want, yet are lost on death. Are these weapons fair? Are they broken? Are they underpowered? We're gonna try and figure that out today. With that said, let's roll. Let's start off with probably the least notable of the 3 crit storing weapons in the game, being the Manmelter. I'm sure that when I said there were 3 weapons in the game like this, some of you had to run a check in your heads to figure out which one I could have been referring to. And yeah, the Manmelter isn't exactly a terribly memorable weapon. It's a Weta Workshop ray gun after all, which are famously one of TF2's less prestigious item categories. However, I have had some Manmelter truthers come out of the woodwork on my previous videos and tell me that it's actually really good, with one guy even going so far as to say that it's Pyro's best in slot secondary. That got me curious to earnestly try it out. The Manmelter is a secondary flare gun replacement for Pyro that fires a fast-moving arced projectile that deals 30 damage on hit and briefly ignites enemies with Afterburn. The projectile itself moves 50% faster than Pyro's other flare guns, and with Afterburn considered, this weapon can do a default maximum of 90 damage. On top of that, it doesn't require ammo and can be fired as many times as you want, with the only condition being a brief buffer period between shots that's signaled by the gun clicking and setting out a bit of sparks. All of this combined makes spamming Manmelter shots into crowds of enemies or choke points a totally effective strategy and something that's worth considering in the thick of things. However, the Manmelter's main positive is its ability to slurp the fire off of ignited teammates, extinguishing them, healing the Pyro for 20 health, and granting you a stored crit all at once. This is hypothetically pretty redundant, as Pyro already has an air blast that does the first 2 things on command, has secondaries that can guarantee critical hits whenever you want on burning targets, and it requires the enemy team to have an actively contributing Pyro to get the most out of it. It sounds like a pretty mediocre weapon, however, I'd say the situations this weapon shines in line up a bit more often than you'd expect. For starters, the Pyro has flamethrowers that actively discourage air blasting. Between the degreaser and backburner's increased ammo cost and the Phlogistinator's complete lack of an ability to do so, the Manmelter by design combos exceptionally well with weapons like these. As for needing enemy Pyros, trust me when I say that there's no shortage of them in casual, and as for this weapon's overlap with the flare gun, I'd say they thrive in completely different circumstances. The flare gun is obviously a potent kill confirming and combo tool, with the player being capable of burning an enemy, air blasting, switching to the flare gun, and landing a 90 damage crit to confirm the kill. This is powerful, but relies on you being capable of getting close to the enemies and trapping them after already having lit them on fire. After the degreaser's numerous nerfs, this has become significantly less consistent. It's still definitely powerful, but not mandatory anymore. By comparison, I'd say that the Manmelter is a very potent poking and surprise tool. Anyone who's ever played Overwatch should be familiar with the concept of poking, where you peck at distant enemies with true damage projectiles to whittle down their defenses before they can get close. The Manmelter is very good at this, as its fast projectile, infinite ammo, lack of damage falloff, and overall spammability make it a premier option for whittling enemies down from a distance. When you combine this with guaranteed stored crits which deal 90 damage plus 60 in afterburn that, let me remind you, last as long as you can live and until you use them, can really facilitate a powerful, surprise damaging Pyro playstyle. If you combine this weapon with either the Flog or especially the Backburner, you're skirting around most of those weapons' biggest downsides in pretty comfortable fashion. It's honestly really fun, and it feels really good to be able to instantly remove fire from the enemy while also healing yourself a bit and granting guaranteed extra damage. It adds a bit of an extra benefit to what's already one of Pyro's most important and class-defining features, and overall makes for a really dynamic and fun play experience that genuinely feels different from the flare gun. That's not to say that it's perfect though, as the Manmelter definitely does have some issues. On a technical side, the radius to be able to suck the fire off of teammates feels pretty inconsistent. It might be ping dependent for all I know, oftentimes requiring you to be rubbing hitboxes with the target, and the huge fire effect that shows up when you shoot a crit is really distracting and blocks a ton of your vision. It can make it hard to adjust your aim in the last few frames before your attack actually goes out. On a more meta level, this gun obviously competes with the Scorch Shot and Detonator, which are two flare guns its use cases are much more specialized than the Manmelter, and it struggles a bit from Pyro's base mechanics as a class. The other two weapons in this video require a more distant passive participation in fights from the player, whereas the Manmelter encourages the Pyro to be right in the thick of things to gain its primary benefits. It's very easy to die, and when you lose those crits on death, it's not a great combo. But all things considered, I walked away from this project with a pretty positive view on the Manmelter. It's an easy weapon to forget, but when you remember it, it's a pretty fun and unique tool within Pyro's lineup. I wouldn't say that it's their best in slot secondary or even my second or third choice, but it's one that I can definitely see the merits in after using it for this video. If you've never really tried the Manmelter out, give it a whirl after finishing this video. It's not amazing, but it's not bad by any stretch either. That said, on to our next subject.
Being dead just got me mad.
Whereas the Manmelter was a fun if mid-tier weapon, our next entry is a fun if very high-tier weapon. It's also probably the most well-liked in this video, the Frontier Justice. I don't know about you guys, but I've literally never seen someone complain about this weapon or claim that it's overpowered or broken, outside of general complaints regarding the mini-sentry battle engineer playstyle. And even then, if you struggle to kill a battle engineer enough that you feel that they're overpowered, that probably says more about you than it does about the balance of the game. Regardless, the Frontier Justice is a sublime weapon. While it's not as meta or class-defining as something like the Rescue Ranger, or as unique as something like the Widowmaker, it's still a strong tool that can really flourish in the right hands. It requires a bit of passive setup and actively doing your job as engineer for a bit to get the most out of it, and is all around a really fun weapon. But what makes it so fun? What makes the Frontier Justice tick as a tool for engineer? Well, let's dive into it and find out. The Frontier Justice is an unlockable shotgun for Engineer that fires at the same rate as stock, deals the same amount of damage, and fires the same amount of pellets per shot. That sounded pretty familiar. However, it only loads half as many shots per clip, storing a maximum of only 3 shots at a time before needing to reload. This alone makes it a direct downgrade from stock when using it for general frontline battle engineer fighting, as you're effectively only dealing 50% of your maximum damage before needing to reload. However, the Frontier Justice is balanced out by one very specific yet very powerful positive stat, gaining revenge crits when your sentry is destroyed. Revenge crits are stored whenever your sentry does its job, with 1 being rewarded for an assist and 2 being rewarded for a kill. Once your sentry is destroyed, so long as you as the engineer are alive and have the Frontier Justice equipped, you will be given a supply of guaranteed stored crits to use whenever you want based on how many kills your sentry got. This caps out at 35 crits, or just over 17 kills with your sentry, and the crits are both lost on death and not earned at all if the engineer is dead when his sentry goes down. This alone gives the Frontier Justice a ton of inherent push and pull between the engineer and his enemies. The engineer can hang by his sentry and turtle to his heart's content, but in order to use his revenge crits, he'll need to survive his sentry's destruction. For the enemy, it might be a bit of a red flag where the engineer is demonstrably alive yet isn't protecting his sentry gun. This adds a bit of an intrinsic skill-based back and forth between the Frontier Justice engineer and his opponents. Destroying the sentry is a choice on both ends that yields positives and negatives for both teams. Once the sentry goes down and the engineer is rocking his revenge crits, he's suddenly roaming the map with a potentially unlimited supply of 180 damage shots that he can use at his own discretion. When the engineer is using the Frontier Justice, he always has a backup plan in tow, and his sentry is hardly the last of the enemy team's concerns. Couple this with the fact that he can potentially rebuild while still maintaining his revenge crits to snowball even more, and you've got a recipe for a frighteningly strong Texan. Helping this is the fact that the Frontier Justice is a shotgun. That means that, unlike the other two weapons in this video, it fires multiple crit pellets with each shot within a frontal cone, and thus does not require pinpoint perfect aim to get the most out of. If you hit the enemy with even a few of your revenge crit pellets, they're taking a significant chunk of damage, and that gives this weapon a degree of leniency that the other two crit storing weapons do not have. There is a bit of wiggle room in terms of how accurate you have to be in order to get the most out of it. However, even with all of these positives, the Frontier Justice is still not a perfect weapon, and there is still plenty of counterplay to it. For one, despite the NG rocking some big damage, he still only got a maximum of 150 health with the Gunslinger, and no mobility once his sentry goes down, and is still very easy to out-DM and take down, even with his revenge crits. Once he's gone, his crits all go with him. It's very easy to interrupt a Frontier Justice NG's potential game-winning snowball. On top of that, if you can capitalize and either kill the Engineer at the same time as his sentry, or kill a sentry while he's already dead, then he doesn't get the crits at all. All of those kills his sentry got effectively go to waste. The Frontier Justice is very strong when it works, but it requires multiple positive conditions to line up in the Engineer's favor for him to get the most out of it. It does have a significant amount of very easy counterplay. On top of that, the 3 less bullets per clip thing is pretty huge. If an Engineer has this thing equipped for an entire round as a precaution in case his sentry goes down, then he's effectively rocking a stock shotgun with 50 less potential damage per clip. If you notice that he has it and the gun isn't glowing, then you can usually afford to be pretty aggressive. The Engineer packs, if I may, a little less gun when he doesn't have revenge crits using this weapon. But honestly, I really like that about the Frontier Justice. This was actually the first crit storing weapon that Valve ever added to the game, and I think they knocked it out of the park on their first try. It has an incredibly powerful, tantalizing upside, yet one that comes with multiple inherent risks and loads of intrinsic counterplay. This really is a very intelligently designed weapon, and one that I think that people kind of sleep on. Not in a use amount way, you see plenty of Engineers running this thing, but more in an admiring its design sort of way. It's cool. I like the Frontier Justice. But what would happen if we inverted everything I just said and made a very poorly designed crit storing weapon? One that took all of the counterplay and positives of the Frontier Justice and flipped them on their heads. What happens then? Well, let's find out.
All in a day's work.
Okay, so just take everything I just said about the Frontier Justice, but make it annoying instead. I know you guys watched my skill check weapons video and were outraged by me claiming that the Conniver's Kunai required thought and opportunistic precision to use well, so you'll be elated to know that I am firmly in the Diamondback is a bit silly camp of thought. This is one of the most contentious and widely hated weapons in TF2, with many players decrying its goofy-ah design and even some professional spy mains actively refusing to use it. I'm personally not as down on this weapon as others. I certainly think it's poorly designed, but I haven't been killed by it enough or capitalized on its snowball potential enough to really feel strongly about it either way. That said, most people really hate this thing. But why is that? What makes the Diamondback such a controversial weapon? Let's discuss it. The Diamondback is an unlockable revolver for spy with a sleek futuristic design. It boasts a flat 15% damage penalty as its primary negative, putting its damage on par with the Ambassador without the firing speed penalty. However, you know how the Ambassador was infamously nerfed into the ground in Jungle Inferno and requires a fair amount of in-the-moment precision at a very specific range to get the most out of? The Diamondback just kind of laughs at that. The Diamondback's primary positive is that it stores guaranteed critical hits for every sapped building and every backstab that the spy earns, capping again at 35 and dealing a per crit damage of 102. One thing that we haven't discussed about critical hits up to this point in the video, as it hasn't really been relevant to the previous two weapons, is that they mitigate damage fall off, always dealing their maximum no matter how far away the enemy is from the attacker, with some exceptions. This means that a spy with a Diamondback crit can fire off what are effectively 102 damage hit scanned sniper rounds from any range, so long as he's able to set up a bit first. And that right there is the main problem with the Diamondback. Despite the fact that it does have a 15% damage penalty compared to stock, it rewards the spy incredibly handsomely for performing his base function as a class. Giving the spy guaranteed stored crits for sapping buildings and especially earning backstabs would be like giving the scout guaranteed stored crits for double jumping or Demo Man guaranteed stored crits for destroying buildings. It's giving players an incredibly powerful boost for doing something that is basic and integral to the role of their class. Rewarding players for doing their job well is fine, but there is such a thing as being too generous and rewarding the wrong things. And unlike the Manmelter, which requires switching off of a powerful combo and mobility tool, or the Frontier Justice, which has a ton of risk and counterplay, the Diamondback doesn't really have too many downsides outside of that 15% damage penalty. Unlike the Ambassador, which also has a slower firing speed and has its crits affected by damage fall off on top of its damage penalty, a spy with the Diamondback performing its job well is effectively always sitting on guaranteed 102 damage shots from any range. The spy doesn't have enough strong best-in-slot picks to make equipping the Diamondback anything but a no-brainer to a player intending to use their gun at any point. Maybe the Lestrange? I don't know. 15% less damage isn't a huge downside if you're almost always going to be hitting for 102 when you're playing well. And I know what you might be thinking. Well, Spy is a frail class who's easy to kill, and he loses his crits upon death. Isn't that a risk? Well, yeah, but the Spy also has more ways to skirt guaranteed death than Engineer or Pyro, and his means of gaining more crits after a death requires less investment. You can easily equip the Dead Ringer or Spycicle alongside this thing, or if you're extra daring, bring the Kunai and get a guaranteed 210 health overheal alongside that free crit. If a Spy is playing in a stealthy manner and only taking attacks of opportunity, it can be very difficult to snuff him out before he can get a crazy snowball roll going. A spy can easily earn and maintain a good amount of Diamondback crits while also playing much more picky-choosy with his fights than Engineer or Pyro. And while a Pyro has to be on the front lines, extinguishing teammates and doing their best to mitigate any damage they're taking while doing that, and an Engineer has to build a sentry and get kills or assists on it, which can be difficult depending on the map and game state, a spy just has to sneak behind and sap a teleporter, or backstab an AFK heavy. Also, fun fact, crits do not show up on the spy's disguises, so you can very easily be mollywop for 102 damage from someone you thought was your teammate due to having no means of knowing that the spy they could potentially be has Diamondback crits. Kind of makes the Enforcer's whole 20% extra damage while disguised thing seem a bit pedestrian, huh? And what's really messed up is that even if the spy can't kill you with his allocated crits, he's still taking a significant chunk of health with even one, and against anyone who's not a heavy, is putting every class within 1 or 2 shot range even without a crit after landing a single one. And even in the worst case scenario for the spy, where he beefs nearly all of his crits and dies, landing a single one still puts a class at a significant disadvantage to any other enemies around them, and the spy can do this from any range. Personally, not a huge fan of the Diamondback. I don't think it's necessarily broken or even over-centralizing, but it's definitely the least well thought out of the 3 crit storing weapons in the game. I've heard people propose a lot of ways to fix it, such as granting mini crits instead of full crits, reverting it to its pre-2013 state of only granting crits on saps, debuffing the spy while it's active and things like that, but I honestly think it could do with a full rework. Make it a bit more risky and more in line with something like the Ambassador, because right now, it's just a wee bit goofy. I'm sorry this video turned into a stealth assassination mission against the Diamondback. I promise I don't hate you or anything if you use it. This is ultimately still just a gun in a 16-year-old game, but I do think it's important to have perspective on things like this. Maybe there is a reason that the Diamondback is so controversial. I don't know. So where does that leave us? Well, I think we learned a lot about what makes a good and bad design for a crit storing weapon in this video. The Frontier Justice is obviously a great design. It rewards the engineer handsomely for doing his job, but has a lot of inherent risks involved in gaining its primary benefit, and even when you do, you can be snuffed out easily. The Manmelter is a more middling design, definitely being fun, but competing and overlapping a lot with a lot of arguably much better in-slot options. And the Diamondback is just a silly little guy. Giving the player access to weapons that can store up to 35 guaranteed triple damage attacks is hypothetically very problematic, and I kind of love that TF2 has examples that cover every base of why an idea like this would or wouldn't work in terms of balance. We've got strong advocates for it, strong advocates against it, and an advocate that's just happy to be here. Regardless, thanks for watching. I'm sorry if I offended you by making fun of the Diamondback. Go watch my skill-dependent weapons video if you want me to say some positive things about a controversial spy weapon. Regardless, thanks for watching, hope you have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch you all later. Cheers. Also, thanks to whoever gifted me an Australia minigun.